Hello, I am Tom, and today here I have one of my friends with me that I want to bring on the podcast for a very long time, Mike Klein. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing good.
All right. Thank you for doing this with me. I've sent a few invitations to some of my other friends, but I don't think they'll have time to make it, so I think it'll just be us two. What I want to
Oh, that'd
do.
be great.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that sounds great.
All right. Well, we'll see if they get on here or not, but if not, it would probably just be us two. Right now, I wanted to do a video on AronRa about abiogenesis. Did I pronounce that right?
Uh, Abiogenesis is how I've always pronounced it, but I
A
don't know if I'm right either.
abiogenesis.
Abiogenesis, yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, if I can remember right, abiogenesis is where the origins of life and evolution come from inorganic and inanimate objects or substance, right?
Yeah, it's basically a purely naturalistic theory about how life originally arose.
I see. Is it a theory that's a lot of scientists govern over and think it's more true than any other theories about how life began, or is it just another theory that's just out there and some believe it, some don't?
It's a theory that's out there, and even Richard Dawkins has said we really have no idea how life arose, and so it's really, I mean, there are very brilliant scientists who are working on the problem, but so far they're really the number of problems that they've identified with abiogenesis far outweigh any kind of successes they've had in the laboratory.
What? I've also heard there's the theory of like aliens somehow created us, like ancient astronaut theory, but I think that's more like ancient, like that show based off it. What is it called? Like,
Ancient Aliens on the History Channel.
yeah,
Yeah,
I've
I've never actually watched that TV show. And the genesis of that idea actually came from, I believe it was either Watson or Crick, the guys who discovered the DNA, the structure of the DNA molecule. Um, One of them said that um, he thought it was he floated the idea called panspermia, where life and genetic information was too complex to arise on its own, so it had to be planted here by aliens, and that's kind of where that whole thing started.
right. Right. So, well, I'll give them credit for saying that it had to be some sort of intelligent design, but they just had the idea of aliens instead of like a deity or a god, like some sort of higher entity. They Yeah, I want to know. So, is the idea of like aliens making life, is that another like crackpot theory that's most likely not true, or is there actually some scientists who do believe and there's some evidence for it?
As far as I've known, I haven't really seen anybody who really seriously has been an advocate for panspermia or alien seeding life on the Earth. So yeah, I would say it's a very fringe view in the scientific community.
Right. But so abiogenesis, I've heard that before, and I think I have seen of it. Is it the idea that somehow something inorganic like rock, and I've heard a theory that somehow it grew like green blue algae off it, and then evolved into fish, and eventually the other creatures and stuff like that. Is that how it worked? Is that the whole idea behind it?
Well, I think abiogenesis is really mostly concerned with just coming up with the first of how a natural process could produce the first living cell. And if you look at any kind of atheist videos on abiogenesis, that's kind of what they're going for. So like, what can we do, in the lab that can kind of produce the first living cell, and then the have like an individual bacteria cell or something similar to that, then the evolutionists believe then evolution will take over and it will just turn into it will start the whole process of Darwinian selection, Darwinian evolution and natural selection. So what the scientists believe right now, and this is what what's what they believe, but and what they're still trying to prove, is that um, in the I think the when especially like AronRa and a lot of the other atheists out there, they seem to think that the most promising avenue for that would be called the RNA world hypothesis. And so it kind of has two different components to it. So there's the simple molecules called lipids are basically what are basically fat molecules, right? And I think it's, not totally unreasonable that they could have formed in by natural processes. And then the neat thing about lipid molecules is that when they get into water, they automatically kind of self-organize into these kind of lipid layers, and if they enclose in on themselves, and you have a self-contained little basically bubble of a fat with a fat film around it, right? And they're saying then the other thing that they think that they're trying to show is that that RNA molecules can self-organize, and some of those RNA molecules can also self-replicate. Now, the problem with that is that when you have these RNA molecules that are capable of self-organizing and self-replicating, well, first off, the whole replicating part of it can't be done by purely natural processes. There has to be actual physical human intervention in the laboratory to make these RNA molecules self-replicate. And another problem is that these self-replicating RNA molecules also contain a purely synthetic nucleotide that doesn't occur in nature. So you're basically inserting intelligently designed aspects into this RNA world hypothesis, and they think that, well, it's we're fiddling with it a little bit, but we're not fiddling with it too much, and so there's still a possibility that this process could have happened by natural processes. But the interesting thing that I've found recently is there's a guy by the name of James Tour, and he is a very, very strong Bible believing Christian, and he is probably at the moment probably one of the best molecular biologists on the planet, and he is actually using using atoms to build molecular machines, and he knows firsthand exactly how difficult it is to even design and build one molecular machine, which by comparison is way, way, way simpler than anything that you would find in a living cell. And he's saying, you have to know what your end goal is, and even when you know what your end goal is, you're going to hit roadblocks that and so you have to have like multiple different pathways of kind of doing solving the same problem. And he says that really there's based on what he knows about how molecular machines work, he's saying that not only can you not get those by purely natural processes in something called in a thing like abiogenesis, but he's also saying that evolution would basically, it would be impossible for evolution to produce those types of molecules as well that are needed for life in the cell. So what happens with atheists is that they just have a very kind of limited idea of what needs to be done, and a very simplistic idea of what needs to be done, and they don't really know the vast difficulties of the actual science involved. And James Tour, the guy I mentioned earlier, he has a standing kind of challenge out to any atheist biologist saying, yeah, can you show me how evolution produces molecular machines? Because based on what I know, I don't think it's possible. And so far, he has not had anybody who's been able to explain it to him in any real sense, because evolutionary biologists aren't really dealing with the molecular level, and he's saying, yeah, it's just It just doesn't work as far as he can see.
Very fascinating. So with the whole abiogenesis, it's very difficult for it to happen, and it most likely didn't happen in a way. I would see that abiogenesis, what it so basically the whole idea with this of what you just told me, it's very difficult and most likely it couldn't be possible. And then atheists skip this over and just go straight to abiogenesis and think this is where we came from, to fill in the gap and hole of how, where life came from.
Yeah, and they will do something similar to what a lot of theists do, where they call it, where they accuse us of always using God of the gaps argument. Well, they always say, well, we don't know about how it works now, but eventually we will find out. Science um, will fill in the gaps. Well, then I think that is just as much of a logical fallacy as a God of the gaps, because it's like there's no way that we can say for sure that a future scientific discovery will fill in the gap that we have right now. And they think that the gaps are small, but in reality the gaps are huge. And 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 some of the work that that I've read recently is saying that even if we have even if everything works just as evolutionists and people who believe in abiogenesis, even if it works the way it does, it's still probably it's very likely that it could be impossible that there could be a naturalistic explanation.
Is there the slightest chance that abiogenesis actually could be true and can work just by the slightest chance?
Based on what I've seen, what I've read recently, you know, um, I would say that even okay, even Darwinian evolution is facing some really really serious problems, and you have to have abiogenesis in order for Darwinian evolution to work. And if Darwinian evolution isn't even working based on some of the scientific discoveries that have been made recently, I don't see there's any chance at all that abiogenesis could be true.
Right. I was wondering that, seeing that it's like most likely didn't happen and it's extremely rare for that to happen, it kind of reminds me of how the universe is so finely tuned and it most likely needs some sort of creator design. Would it be possible? And this is just an idea of mine because I've seen evolution and it doesn't really bother me that much. It doesn't really confirmed against the idea of there being a living God. And I'm now a theist because I think it is very possible right now. I used to be like a Gnostic, and I thought what a lot of atheists would say were probably true. But then after a while, I just realized a lot of them just want to believe what they want to believe and aren't really that much in science at all. It's kind of ironic after all these years. I realized that, and so far, I think it might be possible that a God does exist, and then evolution could exist possibly. And I was thinking, if that is possible, is it possible that abiogenesis, if it's so unlikely and so rare for that to happen, do you think it is possible for that to for abiogenesis to exist, and from that come, natural selection and evolve from evolution, and then also there be a God at the same time?
Um, yeah, so as a Christian and as a theist, I would say that you know um, my personally, I have never been convinced by the evidence I've seen for evolution that it is it is a fact. And I know that a lot of people are kind of a lot of people overstate it and say that, oh yeah, it's been proven, it's a fact. There's no debate about it anymore. And I don't understand how people hold that position. Although I will say that as a Christian, a it's not important to my faith that evolution be false. If evolution ended up being true, it wouldn't affect my faith as a Christian. But the but as far as the abiogenesis goes, um, I really have no idea how. I mean, I'd say that based on what the science is saying right now, I would say it's impossible. And if there was some sort of natural process that was at some point discovered in the future, it's not going to look anything like what they're looking for now. It's going to be something completely different. And based on what they're looking for now, they're never going to find it.
Okay. Just wanted to warn about that. Also, actually, before we start the video on AronRa, I should know a little bit about your background. So, you're an instructor.
Yeah, I was a math and science teacher. I'm not doing that currently, and I just have a science education degree and a bachelor of arts in education and science education.
Well, that's great. I mean, I'm really glad that you got to be a chance on here on this podcast. I wanted you on here from the start and the beginning, but I knew you were busy, and some things came along for you to work on. But thank you for doing this right now, and it would be great just to have you on here. So let's get started with the video on AronRa.
Okay.
All right. And how this works is that I played a video, and then after AronRa is talking about subject or is done talking, you can tell me whenever to stop, and then you make your response or objection to what he says. Anything that he says that is, a fallacy or incorrect. All right.
Okay.
Here we go.
I'm Aaron from Living Science Videos. In previous videos, we talked about what some people used to think about what life is and where it comes from. We listed the criteria required to be considered alive, but we didn't really talk about how the first life began or the science behind the origin of life. And this is where biology refers to geology. In fact, multiple fields of science overlap to reveal the same pattern. There's a detailed record written in the rocks, literally recorded in stone in the many layers of the geologic column. This history of life on Earth has been well established for centuries and is made more robust with every new discovery. We're not just talking about fossils, but trace indications of changing environmental conditions in different periods down through the ages. According to every ounce of paleontological evidence anyone has ever dug up, the further back in time you look, the simpler and more similar living things appear to be until there are only single cells, and prior to that, there's no evident life of any kind at all. There were no primates 100 million years ago, no mammals 200 million years ago, no dinosaurs 300 million years ago, and no land animals whatsoever 400 million years ago. 500 million years ago, there weren't any insects or vertebrates with actual bones, and 600 million years ago, there weren't even the most primitive fish yet. All there are from back that far are things so bizarre we don't know what they are. We've never found any trace of fossils for macroscopic life forms prior to 700 million years ago, but we do have bacterial microfossils covering another 2.8 billion years prior to the first multicellular anythings we've ever found a trace of. The only possible conclusion we can draw from all that is that for the first 80% of the history of life on this planet, the most advanced organisms were merely microbes. It is very rare that anything is ever fossilized, and when that happens, it's usually only the hard parts that leave any impression. We can still find tracks and tunnels of worms and that sort of thing, but not everything leaves trace fossils. The smaller it is, the harder it is to leave a recognizable imprint. So if we're talking about single-celled microbes without any bones or shells or teeth, then circumstances have to be perfect, and we'd have to know exactly where to look, or we wouldn't find any trace of them at all.
Did you get any of that?
Oh yeah, I got that. Yeah, so we talked about this earlier, that this abiogenesis video that he made, the very first part of it doesn't even deal with abiogenesis. He's just talking about paleontology and the geologic timescale. And so there really isn't anything that he said so far that's like, really, it's pretty well accepted science up to this point, but it's not, so you would think that if you're making a video and you're naming it abiogenesis, that the majority of it is going to be, and you're going to start off with talking about actual abiogenesis, which he hasn't even touched on abiogenesis and up until this point yet. So.
Right. So did AronRa did any good research on this video, or is he like, in your professional opinion, like, is he doing good with this video, or is he not doing a well research on it?
Well, I don't know was what he's saying so far is correct. So I have no problems with what he said so far.
Okay, let's continue then.
Lights are a notable exception. Some microbes,
Okay.
like cyanobacteria, live in colonies and leave secretions that catch grains of dust and concrete them, eventually building up these large rock-like structures. These account for some of the oldest fossils in the world, dating back 3.5 billion years. Some stromatolite-building microbes use photosynthesis to produce their food, and they can live without oxygen, but they expel oxygen as a waste product, just like plants do today. The abundance of these type fossils all over the world for billions of years before the appearance of multicellular organisms implied that they produced a lot of oxygen, enough to envelop the whole world. Initially, this oxygen was absorbed into the oceans and then into exposed iron on land, turning it into iron ore. But rock layers from 600 million years ago showed that they had finally absorbed all the oxygen they could, and the rest became our atmosphere and our ozone layer relatively quickly. Prior to that, it seems that the atmosphere was made of greenhouse gases that would have been poisonous to us and wouldn't have protected us against solar radiation. However, oxygen...
Can we stop it here?
To most...
Oh yes, go ahead.
Okay, so here's his first mistake. So in 1955, I believe, there was a grad student by the name of Stanley Miller, and he was doing basically he was trying to create amino acids in the lab, and he was working for his professor's name was Dr. Urey, and so it's called the Miller-Urey experiment. And so at that time, back in the 50s, they did believe that the early atmosphere was made up of this particular set of gases, and that's basically what AronRa is saying right now, is that there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, and and he hasn't talked about the percentage of gases of like methane and all this kind of stuff that that was thought to have been in the atmosphere at the time. Well, paleoclimatologists have now looked at the evidence, and they see evidence that the initial gas percentages that Miller used in his experiment was not what was actually in the atmosphere at the time. And so, but the thing that's important for abiogenesis is that if you don't have an oxygen-free atmosphere, then the experiments that they've used, that Miller used to produce amino acids, which was an important part of abiogenesis, they don't work. So this is like the first error I see in his video, is that he's basically going back to 1950s research to make the case of what kind of gases are in the atmosphere in order to say that the Miller-Urey experiment actually did work and it was capable of producing amino acids, when right now they're still thinking that it probably didn't. And another thing about the Miller-Urey experiment, I think he will probably get into it in the next little bit, is that if he shows a picture of it, you will see that it is a pretty complicated system, and it would be, in my mind, impossible to see anything that was similar to that, actually existing in a natural environment. So, okay, let's go ahead and continue on with the video.
So this is the part where atheists skip over, where it's very difficult for something to happen, but they'll skip that over and say, oh, it's entirely impossible for that to happen. All right, So let's continue then. All right.
Yeah.
Aerobic organisms, and the new atmosphere would have killed off many primordial life forms. So the world in which life first emerged would have seemed to us like an inhospitable, toxic, volcanic nightmare. It was more chemically active and radioactive, with the moon much, much closer than it is today. It was a much more energetic world, and that may have been the key to cooking up increasingly complex chemicals, eventually leading to life. Some people thought that a single experiment could produce life from simple chemicals, but they didn't realize how complex living cells actually are. This would require multiple processes over a series of different stages. Some of that happens easily. The ingredients which form the most basic cell structures create a phospholipid bilayer automatically upon contact with water due to their combined polarity. Likewise, the function of enzymes and transport vesicles and all other minuscule but critical elements within a cell all conform to physical properties. But we have to start with the right basic chemicals. In order to show whether life could emerge naturally, scientists first had to show that the environment could have derived complex organic compounds out of relatively simple inorganic ingredients, and that this could have happened incidentally within that environment. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey created a sealed artificial atmosphere of water, ammonia, methane, and hydrogen, and they proved that when heated and electronically charged, these would produce amino acids, the building blocks of living proteins. They repeated the experiment with different gases according to different hypotheses for the atmosphere of the prebiotic Earth, and all of them produced amino acids. One of these experiments, called the volcano...
Okay, well, stop it.
Yep.
Okay, so and the only thing that he's not saying is that if there is any oxygen in the atmosphere, this experiment doesn't work, and there's lots of scientific evidence that would indicate that oxygen may have been present in that atmosphere, and if that was the case, then the Miller-Urey experiment would not work. So that's he's kind of glossing over that or deliberately not talking about that. So that's a problem right there. So
Right. Okay, I see that. Yep.
Chemicals common in volcanic eruptions: carbon dioxide, nitrogen, hydrogen sulfide, and sulfur dioxide. That experiment turned out to produce 22 amino acids and a few other organic molecules. Shortly thereafter, Sidney Fox studied the spontaneous formation of peptides, short chains of amino acid monomers, and he demonstrated that as they dried, they developed into long strings called polypeptides, becoming increasingly complex. Then it was discovered that these could even form in outer space. Fragments of the Murchison meteorite, a 4.5 billion-year-old chondrite that fell to Australia in 1969, were found to contain a great many different types of as yet unidentified molecules of extreme complexity, in addition to simple organic molecules such as sugars, lipids, and nitrogenous bases. It was also found to contain more than 80 amino acids, some in large amounts. With that established, scientists then had to show how the most important ingredient came about, the extremely complex macromolecule known as DNA. There's another version of genetics called RNA, and activated RNA actually builds DNA. Some viruses don't have DNA, but they do have RNA, and this led many scientists to hypothesize life beginning in an RNA world. RNA and DNA are both made of many times repeated components called nucleotides. It took a while, but researchers have shown how RNA nucleotides could have formed naturally in conditions now expected of the prebiotic Earth. In 2009, organic chemist John Sutherland at the University of Manchester showed how a specific cocktail of relatively simple chemicals became increasingly complex after several cycles of repeated inundation, dehydration, and irradiation. Once the mix became sufficiently complex, after enough repetition, a plausible phosphate was introduced, and the mix spontaneously transformed into ribonucleotides, the precursor of nucleic acids, the building blocks of RNA and DNA. Dr. Sutherland remarked that his laboratory conditions were like the warm little pond which Darwin speculated might be how life first emerged, provided that pond evaporated, got heated, and then it rained, and then the sun shone. Interestingly, the pathway from simple chemistry to complex chemistry to basic biology involves multiple mediums, repeatedly heating and cooling, dousing and drying. This is generally expected to be in solution, optimally near underwater geothermal vents or in volcanic pools near a shoreline. Other scientists had already shown that by dripping solutions of amino acids or RNA nucleotides onto a particular type of clay, it produced polymers. Nucleotide precursors spontaneously assembled into RNA strands, even without the help of enzymes or ribosomes. Another team of researchers at Harvard showed how RNA could even duplicate itself without the normally necessary enzyme. An enzyme is a catalytic molecule which reacts to other molecules performing certain functions. They can metabolize food and digestion, or they can help rapidly replicate macromolecules or make new copies of RNA. In fact, the enzyme itself is actually made of RNA. When double-stranded RNA is heated and divides, one strand contorts into a ribosome and the other becomes a template to be copied. Within the field of abiogenesis research, also known as prebiotic chemistry, there are literally dozens of concordant hypotheses, almost all of which could be true at the same time. Scientists have even composed protocells with some degree of metabolic processes, something similar to the hypothesized hypercycle. So it seems like the whole hypothesis has already been substantiated, but not quite yet. What I'm saying now is a super simple summary of something that is really crazy complex. There is still the question of how such protocells would grow and divide without all of the components we know of from modern cells, which of course the most primitive cells might not even need. That, and some people want to see the whole collection of processes as a single experiment where basic chemicals are poured in and something like bacteria comes out. We're not quite there yet. But speaking personally, what has always inspired me about science wasn't what was already known, but whatever we still don't know or haven't yet shown, because that's where new scientists, perhaps even you, might contribute or discover something profound.
Okay, I really like how he ended the video, because I think, you know, as far as he goes, the way he ended it is like, we still don't know yet. And I know that there was another atheist YouTuber who used this as proof that we know how abiogenesis occurred. And I pointed out to him, it's like, well, at the end of the video, even this video doesn't say that we know how it works. So I liked his level of humility at the end of the video. The science that he's citing is, I think he's nuancing his facts enough to make me happy that, you know, he's not saying we know this is how it happened. I don't think he understands some of the basic problems that I've illustrated, like the RNA, the self-replicating RNA being formed with a purely synthetic nucleotide that does not occur in nature. But yeah, I say that basically his science is good, and his conclusion that we don't know yet, I think I can agree with. But again, I think it's very easy, obviously, for somebody to watch this video and say, oh, well, you know, science is working on it and they're going to figure it out. But, you know, I think if he kind of drilled down more into some of the more difficult problems that need to be solved, it would have been a better video. But I think it actually, on its face, it's not that bad.
Right. No, I actually do like how he ended as well. The shown we still don't entirely know yet. I actually do appreciate that. I've tried to get in contact with AronRa a bit. I didn't get too much answers or messages from him, but he seems to know a lot of science, what he talks about, and I don't mind his videos that much. It's more of Anti-Citizen X and Bionic Dance that really bothered me with those videos. But yeah, the whole idea of AronRa, his so let's go over this right now, the abiogenesis. And he left a few key points that are really our big problem in abiogenesis, to where it might not be possible for it to happen. You know, like you talked about in this video.
Yeah.
Right. I'm glad we make out those points right there. So who was the person that said this is proof? Because I watched this video before, and I wouldn't say it's proof. I say he's shown some evidence and idea that might be possible. But again, it's really difficult for some, like, you know, like the beginning of life from something inorganic to something organic, coming from that, you know, molecules from that. And it is a very difficult process. It's very perplexing. But who's the guy that said this is proof?
The Messianic Manic.
Oh, well, no wonder. I should have known. I thought it would have been some other, like, random YouTuber. So wait, he did a video on this?
I know he did a video on something, and it was in the comment section. It was a debate I had with him in one of the comment sections, and that he was using this as proof that abiogenesis was at least possible, I guess. And I think the problem with possibility is that there are some things that are possible and some things that are so improbable that they are virtually impossible. And I don't think that most atheists are willing to make that distinction. So, for example, I think there's somewhere on the order of 10 to the 70 atoms in the universe. And if so, if you're looking at something that has a probability of 1 to 10 to the 100th or something like that, then in as far as all practical purposes, that's basically an impossibility because we don't just our universe doesn't have enough material and enough time in it to actually make something that improbable to actually happen, right?
Right. I see. Do you think that if not abiogenesis, do you think there might be another theory that can better explain this? So, like one day they might find it.
I really don't know. Like I said, as a Christian, I think that, that there's definitely very good arguments and evidence to believe that God exists. And if God does exist, it seems like a much more reasonable conclusion that there was some sort of divine creation event, like what is described in the Bible, that probably got everything started.
All right. So yeah, speaking of the Messianic Manic, I wanted you on our videos about abortion, but I knew you were busy at the time. You gave me some advice about him pulling up papers, something called living sperm, saying that they're no different than any other life. Like,
Yeah, and he's done this before where, when he goes out looking for, or when he does his research, he's not really researching anything. He's because I actually read the paper that he cited in his video. And basically it's talking about, the paper wasn't making any statement that that a living sperm is equivalent to a human life. It was just making the distinction that so that the title of the paper did say living sperm, and so he's saying, well, sperm is alive, and so how is that any different than a fertilized egg being alive, right? And that's, so you're not going to claim humanity for a living sperm, so why would you claim humanity for a living egg, or for fertilized egg? And so the paper didn't deal with that at all. It was just basically making the point between, or making the distinction between a sperm that's actually living and motile and a sperm that is actually, used up all of its energy and is dead. It's kind of like the difference of saying, well, you wouldn't, I kind of thought the analogy that I kind of thought when we brought that up would be like saying, well, yeah, we have a living skin cell, and in your mind, a living skin cell would be the same as a living human being, and allowing a living skin cell to die would be like allowing a human being to die, which is a completely, ridiculous argument to make.
yeah, I know it is very ridiculous. And weren't we going over one time that so sperm, in a way, is it even same life as like through a cell, but or is it not alive in the same way? Because I knew a lot of scientists say that viruses aren't alive per se, and for something to be somehow alive, it had to go through in a way of like mitosis, or to replicate itself. Or can the sperm?
Yeah.
Yeah. So is the sperm living at all, or is it not?
Okay. So, and I've taught biology at the high school level, and I've also taught it at life science at the middle school level. And so I've dealt with different, and I've also studied biology in college and stuff like that. And so in almost every biology textbook, there is a definition of what is life and what isn't life. And depending on what book you're reading and who's written it or whatever, you are going to probably get, there's probably as many different definitions of life out there as there are different biology textbooks out there. So, but one process that pretty much everybody agrees is a requirement for something to be alive is the idea that a life has to be able to reproduce itself. And the reason why some people think that viruses aren't alive is that even though viruses can reproduce, they can't reproduce by themselves. They have to take their genetic material and insert them into a living cell, and then at that point, that genetic material kind of takes over the cell and uses the cell's own chemistry and molecular machines to reproduce itself. So, in my opinion, I don't think viruses really are alive, because if you just take a bunch of viruses, and stick them in a petri dish and just leave them by themselves, they are never going to reproduce, because they have to have a living cell a host cell to reproduce. So in the same way, a sperm cell would not fit the reproductive component of the definition of what is alive and what is not alive.
Right, because the sperm needs to fertilize egg in order to create life. It has to reach its destination to do that. Yeah, I was.
Yeah, so if you take a bunch of sperm cells and you stick them in a petri dish, in 10 years you're not going to have any more sperm cells. Then they're probably all just going to die. So that's why a sperm cell is not considered a human life in any respect, because it's not even considered life by itself, right?
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, it is like messianic to just read an article and say, "Oh, look, the title right here says it, so it must be true in it." And often, even if he does read the article, he usually will take something out of context. Yeah, he did this with I Inspiring Philosophy on a video on, is atheism a delusion? In his response, he argued the title of the video instead of the information inside the video. Because Inspiring Philosophy, did you see that video?
I did, yeah.
Right, right. So Inspiring Philosophy was talking about that, atheism, it's an unnatural delusion. And his whole argument with the whole entire video IP made was to show that theists, it's completely natural. Not trying to show that God exists or evidence or prove that God exists, but showing it's natural and what they do believe is actually true. They're not making it up. It's atheists that beliefs are actually unnatural and most likely are delusional. And notice that word, he says unnatural, being a form of unnatural brain function or mental illness. And he said that specifically. And then they go back and say that, well, you should have been more clear. And they'll just say that is atheism delusion. They'll say you should have said it's a natural delusion, or title the video differently, a mental illness. And they'll whine and complain about it because they thought they misunderstood what he said. I misunderstood what Messianic said in like the first video I made about him, about abortion. And I admit I was wrong on that. And here's another thing. If you misunderstood someone, if you don't understand it, then ask. Don't go making a video and think you know what the person's saying and then put words in their mouths. That's just completely dishonest right there. And so the whole video Messianic was saying is that, you mean the clinical definition of delusion, but now you're meaning for atheists the other definition of delusion. So the title of your video says, is atheism a delusion? But if you look in a video, he says atheism's beliefs are unnatural. And what do you think unnatural means, If he says unnatural, I'm going to think it's something related to like mental illness or something that's, something that's more like disease-based, not something that is natural that we find, in nature. It's really bizarre how they can just twist words and everyone just loves them over it. But really, to me, I want to do a video on the Rational channel that did this. They ticked me off the most, how they're saying IP's being dishonest while they're being dishonest themselves. What they claim is unbelievable. I know my friend Deflating Atheism and Johan had wanted to make another video to Messianic Manic, and maybe I will, but I do want to make one on the Rational channel. I really have a bone to pick with them. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're recently new.
No, I actually haven't. I should probably check them out.
Yeah, but so you saw the video Inspiring Philosophy make. Did you see the atheist responses to the videos too?
I think I saw the Messianic Manic's response to the Inspiring Philosophy video. Yeah.
What'd you think of that?
We were talking about this earlier, off the podcast, about how when the Messianic Manic makes his videos, it's almost like he's had training as a lawyer or a politician or something like that, because you read it or you read his slides or you listen to what he's saying, and you think he's saying something pretty, you know, dumb and, you know, obviously wrong, and then when you go back and look at it more closely, you see that he's actually, you know, giving himself like a legal out, like a like wiggle room to say, oh well, no, I didn't really actually say that, and you're like, okay, well, yeah, you know, and when you understand that about how he works, his, you know, his videos are really pretty nonsensical, because they're really not saying anything, because if you try to nail him down on something, you realize that he has structured his dialogue in such a way that when you actually try to pin him down on something, you realize that no, he's not making that statement quite as he is. And if you try to pin him down on it, he'll just say, "Oh, I didn't really say that. And I don't really believe that," you know, and just, you know, and then, you know, and his beliefs change based on what argument he's trying to make as well. So he's a very dishonest kind of crafty YouTuber, and I kind of stopped watching him because he's kind of really just boring me a lot. You know, he's either going after low hanging fruit, you know, where he's making a very easy video on something that's, you know, that's not very challenging, or he is trying to address something that's pretty substantive, but then not really saying anything about it.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. He doesn't give his position on something. He'll just, you know, say that whether he'll say something that might be true or not, why it doesn't make sense to him, and he'll gather a group that agree with him on that. And when you challenge him on that, he'll say, well, I don't have an argument, you know, because I don't stand in any position on it, even though we know that he's arguing against it. And
yeah,
he'll also say that I don't understand, you know, that's like logical fallacy, incredulity, you know, I can't possibly understand this, therefore it's not true. You know, that's just because you can't understand something doesn't mean it's not true. I mean, we have a hard time understanding what.
Doesn't he call himself an atheist? And that because he can't understand what the concept of God means, therefore he doesn't believe in God? Isn't that like isn't his whole, basically his whole identity is wrapped up in a logical fallacy of incredulity?
Yeah, pretty much. That's it. A friend of mine actually has been talking to a lot of atheists, especially Messianic Manic, and it's been actually a big help to me. His name's Leo, and he actually wanted to be on this podcast, but something that came up with him. But he's giving me so much information about these guys, and to Jahan and a lot of other of my friends on here. So I'm thinking I'm going to mention him in the next podcast or so. He's but before we go off this topic, actually, I wanted to look up what here. Let me just. I want to look at what Messianic Manic said, like one of his papers on sperm having life, and then look at it and see where it says, you know, if it's actually living or not, just so we can have some evidence to show. Is that all right?
That's fine.
Right. Here we are. Now I know he did like a few pages on this, so here. Well, I'll just pull up one right here. Okay. Here's one right here. Now, this one's in DNA in a single living sperm revealed, blah, blah. Okay, here we go. All right. Now, you said that you reviewed some of these papers and they say nothing about sperm being living, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And I mean, that's not the point of the paper. The point isn't saying, yeah, sperm is alive and we should consider it a human life, which is kind of, you know, or we should, or yeah, or, you know, or that, yeah, it's alive, but it's not a human life. Or, you know, it's not really talking about he's bringing in research that really doesn't have anything to do with the topic that he's discussing. And he's thinking that by showing that sperm is alive, that he can then say that Christians should then consider sperm to be a human life as well, which just doesn't make sense. I mean, it's the paper does not the paper that I read anyway, and I can't remember which one I read, but didn't deal any at all with the fact that sperm was alive, and giving evidence of why sperm was alive or anything like that. It was just making this. It was a side fact. It's like, okay, well, we're not dealing with sperm that's dead. We're dealing with sperm that's alive, and that was the whole point of it. I mean, and the point of the actual paper that I read had nothing to do with the actual argument that he was using it to support.
Right. Right. Yeah. Went over this too and doesn't really have any support. So it's interesting to me because I've tried showing this to so many people, and it's like people that are fans of Masonic Manic don't even read this, and they'll just agree with him on it. So I'm looking at this right here, and it really does. It talks about the idea of a living sperm, but it doesn't say it's alive or not. They're using it in a different context. And Masonic Manic needs to learn not to judge a book by its cover. All right, I think that's common sense, which, by the way, a lot of atheists pretend not to have. So they'll just say, oh, well, you need to make this more clear. Or you say, oh, well, this is wrong because this or that, because how could anyone ever label something like that? They like to twist things around constantly. That's
yeah, and he's done this with me before. I mean, I know there was a paper. It was actually two papers that were combined together, and it was combined and they called the mindful brain. And he thought that was scientific evidence that the mind is purely a product of chemical processes happening of basically brain activity, right? And I was saying, no, when you talk about mind, it's more of a philosophical term. It's not a scientific term. And when you talk about brain research, you're talking about one thing, and you're talking about mind and consciousness. They're talking about something else. And he was saying, well, we've got this paper called the mindful brain. That's so that means that these scientists believe that the brain is that the mind is part of the brain. And the thing is, it was that particular research paper that he presented, he hadn't read, and it was actually made up of two separate papers, and neither one of those titles of those papers mentioned the word mind at all. And I read through the both of those papers, and there was almost it was all about brain research, and they were referring to the brain properly as the brain. They weren't using the word mind or anything like that. And and so it's just one of those things where he's not even reading this stuff that he's citing. He's just pulling the titles and using it for for his own purposes, which doesn't really make sense, because if you actually read what's actually being said, it doesn't have anything to do with what he's talking about.
No, yeah, I've seen that before, and a lot of people, a lot of friends, including Johanna, some friends I even made that point that out, made it clear to me. It's just the way he argues it. It really, you can easily point it out, but it doesn't matter. You can make a video debunking everything he says. He'll go around it and say, well, that's not what I meant, or you did this or that, and he'll find a way to argue. He will never shut up about something. You can, squish him and slam him to the ground, and step on him, and then he'll brag about how you got your shoes dirty. That's basically what he does. We made a response to him on abortion because he didn't answer any of our questions. So we made a response, we answer him again and say, answer our objections we have. And we point out what he said was wrong, saying that abortion, can actually relieve me of, the suffering and psychological trauma of having a child. And then we showed there's so many scientific evidence and facts on, no, actually, people who get abortions, actually bad for them. If they have to carry the child for them, it's actually better for them. And he had nothing to say. Not one fanboy came to us, and he didn't even mention about it. And I told Jahan and Deflate Atheism, sent this to him or put it on your channel if you want to and see what happens. He didn't say anything because I think we got him on that. So when you get him on something, he won't mention it. He'll just ignore you, which I'm fine with because I didn't want to be like a forever go back and forth response battle. So I just wanted to move on. We did one on Anti-Schism X, and now I'm doing one with you on AronRa. So I did see a few videos with you made about AronRa, so I'm going to put them in the description below. And what are your thoughts on AronRa?
I know he's a pretty high profile, and I think that I think that the problem he has mostly is that he goes into these diatribes, sometimes, and 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 he just puts out things and just makes assertions and doesn't. I know that he always, like, on the slide when he's, or on the screen behind him when he's talking about things, he's trying to put things up, like, quotes or whatever, but he never actually references them. He just makes the statement and then puts the quote behind him, saying that, and that you're supposed to, I guess, supposed to pause the video and closely look at the quote that's on the screen behind him and to see what, but I wish that he would kind of put those things into it, in actually, into his dialogue. But a lot of things he says are just plain wrong. Like, the video I made just recently about him, he was saying that overwhelming. He was specifically listing some specific scientific fields that they're overwhelmingly atheist. Well, atheist statistics are very, very low, and they've been historically been low, and there are more people who are claiming to be atheists now, and I will admit that. But when he's saying an overwhelming majority, first of all, it's a kind of a fuzzy figure, but you would think that it would at least be over 50%. And 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 in the video that I made in response to him, I showed that that none of these fields that he was talking about had more than 50% of people claiming to be atheists in them. And and the actual, if you look at all scientists altogether, it's about 41% don't claim to have any kind of belief in God or the supernatural. But from my perspective, I would say that the atheists hate the word agnostic, and they think that agnostics are actually atheists. So, but I would say that unless you're saying you're an atheist, you're not an atheist. And so I would say that the 41% that I pointed out, probably a subset of that would actually be true atheists. And probably most of them would be willing to just, and in my experience with studying science at the university, I had plenty of and I studied science at a very liberal university in Washington, and most there was, I don't really know of any of the science professors that I had that were dyed-in-the-wool atheists. I think they all were open to, at least being agnostic, or some of them, like my favorite paleontology professor, he believed in God. He said he didn't think there was any other way that the universe could have come about if there wasn't some sort of God. So yeah, and so this idea that the idea that the atheists are putting out is that if everybody was just educated enough and smart enough and knew enough science, that everybody would be an atheist, and that's just simply demonstrably false. And I don't know exactly sure why they continue to believe in it.
I think they just want to push their own beliefs and saying that there's not a God, and what they want everyone to be on their side. A lot of them try to rule the internet, but now they're realizing that they don't have much ammunition to attack Christianity and theists, because theists, on the other hand, are having lots of evidence and scientific facts to back them up. So what a lot of atheists will do is pretty much hide behind their videos, and their fans. And I wouldn't say all atheists are like that. There's a difference between an atheist and a militant atheist. There's atheists who do have a hard time believing in God, and I've met a few who are just it's just their own way of belief. But I met a lot of atheists in person, and then they matched the characteristics online, how they're just uptight, very rude, snarky, condescending, thinking they know everything. And when you point out they're wrong, they just get angry and frustrated with you. It's and I was actually an agnostic. I didn't know, if God was true or not. I mean, it's possible, but I didn't know. There was even a time where I even questioned free will, because I thought science, was arguing against for it. And when in my philosophy class, I was arguing with a classmate named David, and over the time I would lose to him because everyone went with his, side of free will because there's more evidence to support it. And when I actually tried to talk to a bunch of atheists, including Anti-Citizen X, which he wasn't a big help. He just repeated the same stuff over and over again. That's how I lost. And I asked Mesak Mac to be on, if he could be on like a chat, video chat, for me in my class to help me out with debate. But he didn't want to do that because he was too busy, and he didn't really help me that much with free will. I even used some of his videos, and everyone was laughing in my class. And I used to think Mesak Mac and a few other atheists were kind of smart, had a few good points. I didn't agree with everything with them. But eventually, the more I did this, I actually did win in the classroom about saying there's no free will, but only because I convinced people, not because, I had evidence on my side, because I started to convince people. And that's where I realized all these evidence for people have on free will, it's outstanding. And the only reason I won because I actually convinced people. There's actually a vote in the end we had, a little different, where we would vote, you see how many people would vote for each side. And I didn't think that was a good way for discussion or even debate. And at the end, I even told David, I'm sorry what happened. And I just wanted to, I thought, I'm not saying that free will, was a big problem with me. I was just trying to understand it, how it's even possible. But then I realized that there is so much evidence on it. And, just because you can't explain it all the way, much like gravity, we have a hard time explaining gravity. That doesn't mean it's not real or exist. And when I try to get back to some of these atheists I talked about, they were being so loudmouth and snarky back at me. And I realized no matter what evidence I give them, they'll just say, well, that's not true. That's not right. And I see them make fallacies all the time. And I realize, my gosh, they just want to be right. They don't care. And that's when I moved to the idea of like theism, when I said, okay, these guys are bad. Let's just, move on to something else. So I went to Inspire Philosophy's videos. Then when I saw his videos, I took him back in my philosophy class and showed him about the idea of God. And then a lot of people were very, didn't know if it was true or not, and thought, well, the idea of God, the whole fine tuning and the whole Leibniz's cosmological argument. But then I showed them Anti-Citizen X videos and a few other atheist videos. And it was the funniest part. Few of my friends, including me, fully went, okay, these videos are terrible. We're just going to move over to theism. And
Yeah,
that was my experience. I have 3 friends who I think one of them might have been atheist or some of them were agnostic, but they said, wow, these videos are terrible. I'm just going to go with this guy, Inspire Philosophy, because he's making a lot more sense and they can actually talk to him and get questions out of them that make more sense, And I've been talking to Inspire Philosophy. He's been helping me with a lot because I question a lot of things in the Bible because I don't understand them. And I'm not saying Inspire Philosophy, gets everything right, but I think he tries better than they are like apologists I've seen. And it's really interesting. So that's when I told Mesak Mac that I'm not following him anymore. I'm now a theist because I see the lies deception you have. So now I'm moving on to theism. And apparently I miswrote theism, and he just made a big joke about that, insulting me. Gee, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry I miswrote something. I see him misspell something sometimes in comic section, and especially what Jahan showed me and what Leo showed me. He really is just full of himself. As a matter of fact, Leo showed me that the reason why Mesak Mac is angry at Inspire Philosophy because he saw his testimonial page. He's doing well of converting, people into Christianity, and I think some of Mesak Mac's groups fall in Inspire Philosophy now, and he's rising up higher and higher. And I think Mesak Mac's realizing he's being left in the dirt right now. He's not doing that well. So that, and other atheists too. Yeah, so that's sort of how I came to theism. And then I talked to AronRa, and we had long conversations. And I said, hey, why not a podcast? And he immediately loved the idea. He told me, okay, let's do the abortion one. Let's make a response to this one now. And let's do this. Let's get Deflating Atheism on here. I called Deflating Atheism. We met each other, we chat. We got him on here. So it's been doing good so far. And this is the 4th podcast we made. So yeah, it's doing really good. And Mike, I just want to say thank you for being on the podcast with me. It's really helpful. And I hope you can make it to some in the future. And I know you're incredibly busy, so I'm not forcing this on you. But I just want to do this one, just you and me, so I just know what it's like to have you on here. And I think we did a pretty good job.
Okay, well, thank you. It was fun.
Yep. Anything else you want to say before we end this?
No, that's it. Just have a great time.
Right, thank you. And join us next time, viewers. We are going to do one on the Rational Channel on a response to that video they made to Inspiring Philosophy. And if I can, I'm going to get a few extra people on here. So Johan Ross, Deflating Atheism, will be joining us. Anyways, thank you, Mike, and we'll see you next time. Take care.